My neighbor locked my 8-year-old outside during a thunderstorm to teach me a lesson. So I turned the entire neighborhood against her. My son Oliver was 8 when we moved to the house on Maple Street. It was a quiet neighborhood with lots of families and kids playing outside until dark. Perfect for a single mom like me working from home while raising a kid. Oliver made friends with the other boys on the street immediately, and they'd play basketball in our driveway or ride bikes around the cul-de-sac. Everything was great for the first few months until our neighbor Janet decided she was the neighborhood authority on child rearing. Janet lived 2 houses down with her 3 kids who were 6, 9, and 11. She didn't work and spent most of her day watching everyone from her front window. At first, it was small comments when I'd see her. Oliver's helmet wasn't tight enough. His bike was too big for him. He shouldn't eat popsicles before dinner. I'd smile and nod because I didn't want problems with neighbors. Then Janet started making rules for all the kids on the street. She put up a sign saying no bikes after 6 p.m. because it disturbed dinner time. No basketball on Sundays because it was the day of rest. No chalk art on sidewalks because it was messy. The other parents ignored her, but she'd stand outside yelling at kids who broke her made-up rules. Oliver would come home upset because Mrs. Janet yelled at him for bouncing his ball too loud or riding his scooter too fast. One afternoon, Oliver was playing with Janet's son Tommy in our backyard. They were building a fort with cardboard boxes when Janet came over and dragged Tommy home, saying Oliver was being too rough. Oliver was confused because they were just stacking boxes. Janet told me boys like Oliver needed more supervision, and maybe I should consider working from an office instead of home. Boys like Oliver. My sweet kid who helped elderly Mrs. Chen with her groceries and read to his little cousin. After that, Janet banned Tommy from playing with Oliver. She told the other moms Oliver had anger issues and influenced their kids badly. Complete lies, but some parents started being weird about playdates. Oliver didn't understand why his friends couldn't come over anymore. Then came the pool incident. I'd bought Oliver a small above-ground pool for the summer. Nothing fancy, just something to cool off in. Janet complained to the HOA that it was an eyesore and attracted mosquitoes. The HOA said it was fine. She then called the city saying we didn't have proper permits. We didn't need permits for a temporary pool. She tried calling child services saying I was creating a drowning hazard. They told her to stop wasting their time. The thunderstorm day changed everything. It was a Thursday in September, and I was on a video call with a client. Oliver was playing outside with his friend Jackson from across the street. The weather was fine when they went out, but clouds rolled in fast. I could hear thunder starting and was about to end my call when Oliver started knocking on the door crying. He was locked out. I ran to let him in, and he was soaking wet and terrified. Jackson's mom called asking if Jackson was at our house because he ran home saying Mrs. Janet wouldn't let them inside. Here's what happened according to both boys and later confirmed by other neighbors who saw it. When the rain started, Oliver and Jackson ran to Janet's house because it was closest, and our door was locked since I was on a call. They knocked asking to wait inside until the storm passed. Janet opened the door, looked at them, and said her house wasn't a shelter for unsupervised children. She told them their parents should be watching them better and closed the door. The boys tried explaining they just needed to wait out the lightning. Janet told them through the door that maybe getting wet would teach me to watch my child properly. Oliver ran home in the storm while Jackson ran to his house. Lightning struck a tree 3 houses down 10 minutes later. I called Janet immediately and asked what was wrong with her. She said it wasn't her responsibility to watch other people's children, and I should be grateful she didn't call the police about 2 boys trying to force their way into her home. Force their way in. 2 scared children knocking on a door. My client heard everything because I hadn't hung up. Turns out she was a family lawyer and told me to document everything immediately. Word spread through the neighborhood within hours. Jackson's mom was furious, and his dad went to Janet's house demanding an explanation. Janet called the police saying he was threatening her. The police talked to Jackson and Oliver and left without doing anything except telling Janet not to waste their time. The next day, every parent on the street kept their kids away from Janet's house. Her kids had no one to play with. Janet tried to organize a neighborhood barbecue that weekend like nothing happened. Nobody came. Her 9-year-old son Tommy started sneaking over to apologize for his mom. I'd give him snacks and let him play video games with Oliver until Janet noticed he was missing. She accused me of kidnapping him. I grabbed my notebook and wrote down everything Janet said at my door, checking the time on my phone to record exactly when it happened. Tommy had been at our house from 3:15 until 4:30, playing video games with Oliver in the living room where I could see them the whole time. I wrote down what they ate for snacks and what game they played, and how Tommy left through the front door when I reminded him his mom would wonder where he was. My hands shook a little as I wrote because calling it kidnapping was so extreme and so wrong that I couldn't believe she'd actually said it out loud. My email pinged while I was still writing, and I saw it was from my client, the family lawyer who'd been on the video call during the thunderstorm. She wrote that she'd be happy to provide a written statement about what she witnessed that day, including Janet's exact words about the boys trying to force their way into her home and how getting wet would teach me a lesson. I typed back thanking her and asking if she'd mind also noting the timeline, since I'd been on a work call when the storm hit and couldn't have been watching Oliver every single second. She replied within minutes saying she'd have the statement ready by tomorrow and would include everything she heard. I added her email to a new folder on my computer labeled Documentation and felt slightly better knowing I wasn't handling this alone. Jackson's mom knocked on my door around 6 that evening carrying a thick stack of papers. She came in and spread them across my kitchen table, and I saw they were screenshots from our neighborhood Facebook group going back almost 2 years. Janet had complained about Jackson riding his bike too early on Saturday mornings. She'd posted about Mrs. Chen's lawn being too long and attracting pests. She'd written a long rant about someone's trash cans being visible from the street on non-collection days. There were complaints about dogs barking and kids playing too loud and cars parking in front of her house instead of in their own driveways. Jackson's mom had been saving every single post, organizing them by date and topic. She told me she started documenting after Janet called the police on her husband, figuring this pattern wouldn't stop and someone would need proof eventually. We spent an hour going through everything while she suggested we get other neighbors to start keeping records too. She said Janet's behavior was getting worse and we all needed to protect ourselves and our kids. I texted the neighborhood group chat that night with a heads up about documenting any interactions with Janet, and within 20 minutes, 4 other parents replied, saying they'd already started their own files. The next morning, I found a note taped to my front door. It was printed on Janet's letterhead with her name and address at the top like some kind of official document. The note said I was encouraging her son to disobey parental authority by allowing him into my home without permission. It said she was consulting with her attorney about legal action for interference with her parental rights and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. It said I should expect formal papers soon, and that I was creating a hostile environment for her entire family. I read it 3 times standing on my porch in my pajamas, then went inside and took photos of it with my phone from multiple angles. I added the photos to my documentation folder and put the original note in a plastic sleeve so it wouldn't get damaged. Then I texted the neighborhood group with a warning that Janet was sending threatening letters, and everyone should photograph anything they received before touching it too much. 2 neighbors replied immediately saying they'd gotten similar notes that morning, one about allowing their kids to play basketball past 6, and another about not controlling their dogs barking. Oliver came downstairs for breakfast and asked why Mrs. Janet was so mean to everyone. He wanted to know if Tommy could still be his friend, or if the grown-up problems meant they couldn't play together anymore. I sat down at the table with him and tried to explain that sometimes adults have disagreements that aren't fair to kids who just want to be friends. I told him Tommy wasn't doing anything wrong by wanting to play, and neither was he. But Mrs. Janet had rules that didn't make sense, and we had to respect them even when they seemed mean. Oliver asked if it was his fault that Tommy got in trouble, and I felt my heart break a little. I promised him he hadn't done anything wrong and that real friendship doesn't disappear just because someone's mom is difficult. He nodded but still looked sad, pushing his cereal around his bowl without eating much. I wanted to tell him everything would work out fine, but I didn't know if that was true. So instead, I just hugged him and said we'd figure it out together. Troy from the HOA board called me that afternoon while I was working. He sounded tired and said they'd received 6 new complaints about Janet in the past week, all from different families on our street. The complaints were about harassment, false police reports, threatening letters, and making up neighborhood rules that didn't exist. He asked if I'd be willing to share my documentation with the board for their records, explaining they were building a file in case they needed to take formal action. I told him I had everything organized and could email it over today. He thanked me and mentioned this wasn't the first time Janet had caused problems, but it was definitely the worst it had ever gotten. He said the board was taking it seriously because involving children and making false accusations crossed a line they couldn't ignore. I sent him my entire documentation folder after we hung up, including the client's statement, the threatening note, and my timeline of everything that had happened since we moved in. Tommy showed up at our back door after school the next day. He knocked quietly, and when I opened it, he looked scared and sad at the same time. He said he told his mom he was riding his bike around the neighborhood but came here instead because he really missed playing with Oliver. His eyes were red like maybe he'd been crying, and he kept glancing over his shoulder toward his house like he expected his mom to appear any second. I knew letting him in would probably cause more problems, but I couldn't turn away a 9-year-old kid who just wanted a friend. I told him he could stay for 1 hour, and then he needed to actually ride his bike around so his mom wouldn't catch him in a lie. Oliver heard Tommy's voice and came running, and within seconds they were upstairs playing video games like nothing bad had ever happened between their families. I set a timer on my phone and tried to focus on work, but mostly I just listened to them laughing upstairs and felt angry that Janet was making everything so complicated for these kids. Janet showed up at my front door exactly 50 minutes later. She pounded on it hard enough that I jumped even though I'd been expecting her. When I opened the door, she pushed past me slightly trying to see into my house. She demanded to know if Tommy was here because he wasn't at home and wasn't answering his phone. I told her calmly that he'd stopped by about an hour ago, but left 20 minutes earlier to ride his bike like he'd told her he was doing. She called me a liar and said she knew I was hiding him. I stepped back and gestured at my empty living room, suggesting she could look around if she wanted, but he genuinely wasn't here. Tommy had left through the back door right after my timer went off, cutting through the yard to the street behind us so his mom wouldn't see him leaving. Janet stood in my doorway breathing hard and looking around like she didn't believe me. Finally, she turned and walked away, muttering about calling the police again and how I'd regret interfering with her family. I closed the door and leaned against it, wondering how long this could possibly continue. That weekend, a moving truck pulled up to the house next to Janet's. I watched from my window as a family unloaded boxes and furniture, noticing they had 2 teenage kids who looked like they could help with the heavy lifting. The mom came over later that afternoon to introduce herself as Lila. She was friendly and funny, making jokes about how much stuff they'd accumulated over the years and how moving day always revealed you owned way too many things. I welcomed her to the neighborhood and mentioned there was a group chat for the street if she wanted to join. She seemed excited about that and gave me her number. 2 days later, she texted the group saying our neighbor had just showed up at her door with a printed list of neighborhood rules including quiet hours and bike curfews and approved outdoor activities. She said she'd politely declined to follow made-up rules and wanted to know if this was normal for the area. 5 neighbors immediately responded, explaining the Janet situation, and Lila replied with 3 laughing emojis and said she'd figured something was up when a stranger handed her a rule book. Lila came over that evening carrying a bottle of wine and asking for the full story. We sat on my back porch while Oliver played basketball in the driveway, and I told her everything from the helmet comments to the pool complaints to the thunderstorm incident to the kidnapping accusation. She kept shaking her head and saying she couldn't believe someone actually tried to enforce a 6 p.m. bike curfew on other people's kids. When I finished, she said she'd be happy to be another set of eyes documenting anything weird Janet did, since she lived right next door and would probably see plenty. She told me about her own kids being teenagers now and how she remembered when they were younger and played with neighborhood friends, without anyone's mom trying to control everything. We finished the wine talking about normal neighborhood stuff like the best pizza place nearby and whether the HOA was generally reasonable, and it felt good to just have a regular conversation with a new friend. Oliver's teacher called me the next Monday morning. She said Oliver had been quieter in class the past couple weeks and wanted to check if everything was okay at home. I explained about the neighborhood situation without giving too many details, just saying there was an ongoing conflict with a neighbor that was affecting Oliver's friendships. She listened carefully and said she'd noticed Oliver seemed worried about something, but hadn't wanted to push him to talk about it. She promised to keep an eye on how he was doing emotionally and offer extra support if he seemed to need it. I thanked her and said I was trying to handle the adult problems without letting them affect Oliver too much, but it was hard when another kid was involved. She understood and suggested I let her know if Oliver started having any trouble at the school related to the situation. After we hung up, I felt grateful that his teacher was paying attention, but also guilty that neighborhood drama was following my kid into his classroom, where he should feel safe and happy. Troy called me 3 days later, sounding like he'd aged 10 years since our last conversation. He explained that Janet had filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, claiming multiple neighbors were harassing her family and creating what she called a hostile environment. The board was scheduling a hearing to address everything at once because they couldn't keep dealing with individual incidents anymore. He apologized for the situation getting this far and said he'd send me the official notice with the hearing date. I thanked him and hung up feeling exhausted before the fight even started. That evening, I spread everything across my dining room table and started organizing. I printed every threatening note Janet had left on my door and put them in plastic sleeves with dates written on labels. I downloaded screenshots from the neighborhood group showing her complaints about various families over the past year. I typed up a timeline starting with her first comments about Oliver's helmet and ending with the kidnapping accusation, including dates and times for everything. My client's written statement about witnessing the thunderstorm phone call went into the folder along with photos of Oliver soaking wet that day. Jackson's mom texted asking if I wanted to coordinate our documentation and came over an hour later with her own binder. We sat at my kitchen table comparing notes and making sure our accounts matched the facts without contradicting each other. She had screenshots I'd missed and I had photos she didn't know about. We organized everything chronologically, so the pattern of Janet's behavior would be obvious to anyone looking at it. Oliver came downstairs asking what we were doing, and I told him we were getting ready for a meeting about Mrs. Janet. He nodded and went back to his room without asking more questions. 2 days later, I found a folded piece of notebook paper that had been slipped under our front door. Tommy's handwriting said he was sorry for everything his mom was doing and that he missed playing with Oliver. He'd been caught sneaking over again, and Janet grounded him for 2 weeks this time. The note ended with him saying he hoped they could be friends again someday. I showed it to Oliver and watched his face crumple. He took the note to his room and I heard his door close quietly. My heart broke for both boys stuck in a situation created entirely by adults who should know better. The next afternoon, I noticed something different about where the neighborhood kids were playing. Instead of spreading out across various driveways and yards like usual, They'd all gathered in the cul-de-sac at the far end of the street. Oliver grabbed his basketball and headed down there to join them. I watched from our porch as he played with Jackson and the others, but every few minutes he'd stop and look back toward our section of the street. He was watching for Tommy, hoping somehow his friend would appear, even though we both knew he was grounded. The distance the kids were keeping from Janet's house was deliberate and sad. They'd created their own safe zone as far from her as possible. A man I'd never seen before pulled into Janet's driveway that Thursday evening. He looked tired getting out of his car, shoulders slumped like he was carrying weight he couldn't put down. Jackson's dad walked over and they stood talking in the driveway for almost 20 minutes. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told me it was serious. This had to be Garrett, Janet's husband, who worked long hours and seemed to miss everything happening at home. When Jackson's dad came back, he stopped by our house and said Garrett seemed overwhelmed and honestly shocked by some of what he'd heard. I wondered how much Janet had been telling her husband about the neighborhood situation versus how much she'd been hiding. Lila came over Saturday morning with coffee and gossip. She'd been hearing Janet on the phone constantly over the past week, making calls to various authorities. Apparently, Janet had called the city about noise violations 3 times, reported suspicious vehicles to the police twice, and even contacted animal control about dogs being off-leash in the neighborhood. None of the complaints had resulted in any action because they were either false or too minor to matter. Lila said it was getting ridiculous listening to Janet's voice through the walls, making complaint after complaint about people just living their normal lives. She'd started keeping a log of the calls with dates and times just in case it became relevant later. The HOA hearing happened on a Tuesday evening in the community center meeting room. 8 families showed up with folders and binders full of documentation. I'd printed everything and organized it with tabs marking different categories of harassment. Jackson's parents brought their materials. Lila had her log of phone calls. Other neighbors had their own evidence of Janet's behavior over the past year. Janet arrived 20 minutes late carrying her own massive binder and looking like she was ready for war. She sat alone on one side of the room while the rest of us filled chairs on the other side. Troy and 2 other board members sat at a table in front, looking like they wished they were anywhere else. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Each family took turns presenting their documentation and explaining specific incidents. Jackson's parents went first with the thunderstorm story, showing photos of the boys soaking wet and the damaged tree from the lightning strike. I presented my timeline of escalating harassment with all the supporting evidence. Other families shared their own experiences with Janet's made-up rules and constant complaints. Troy and the board members took notes and asked clarifying questions. Janet's defense consisted mainly of insisting she had the right to maintain neighborhood standards, and that everyone else was too permissive with their children. She kept saying things about property values and safety concerns that didn't match reality. Her binder turned out to be full of printed screenshots of neighborhood social media posts she'd been monitoring and lists of violations she'd observed from her window. It painted a picture of someone spending enormous amounts of time watching and documenting her neighbors instead of living her own life. Troy called me 2 days later to say the board had reached a decision. They were issuing a formal written warning to Janet prohibiting her from filing frivolous complaints, harassing neighbors, or making unofficial rules for the community. The letter noted that another violation could result in fines or other enforcement actions under the HOA bylaws. He sounded relieved it was over, but also concerned about how Janet would respond. His concern turned out to be justified. Janet's response came within a week. Security cameras appeared on her house pointing in every direction, including directly at neighboring properties. She put signs on her lawn saying the area was monitored for safety purposes. My phone started buzzing with texts from neighbors asking if this was allowed and whether they should be worried. Lila called the HOA immediately. Troy called her back sounding weary and confirmed that technically cameras on her own property were permitted as long as they weren't recording inside other people's homes. There wasn't much anyone could do about it legally, even though it felt like retaliation, and created an oppressive atmosphere on the street. The school counselor's office had posters about feelings and a bookshelf full of board games. Oliver sat on the blue beanbag chair across from Mariana Torres every Tuesday afternoon while I worked from home. She taught him breathing exercises for when adults argued around him. She showed him how to draw his feelings when words felt too hard. She explained that grown-ups sometimes made bad choices that had nothing to do with kids being good or bad. Oliver came home after the 3rd session and told me Mrs. Janet's meanness wasn't his fault. He said Mariana told him some people had problems inside themselves that made them act angry at everyone else. I hugged him and felt grateful someone was helping him understand what I couldn't explain properly. Tommy figured out a system by the 2nd week of October. He passed notes to Oliver through a kid named Marcus who sat between their classrooms at lunch. Oliver would write back during recess, and Marcus would deliver the response before dismissal. The notes said things like, "Mom still won't let me come over," and "I miss playing basketball," and "This is so stupid." Oliver kept every note in a shoebox under his bed. He showed me the whole collection one night, and I saw how much effort two 9-year-olds were putting into staying friends despite an adult trying to keep them apart. It reminded me of spy movies, except there was nothing funny about children needing secret communication just to talk to each other. Lila walked outside to get her mail on a Wednesday afternoon and found Janet standing at her mailbox with letters in her hand. She yelled across the yard asking what Janet was doing. Janet jumped and dropped the mail, then said she was checking if any of her mail got delivered to the wrong address by mistake. Lila marched over and told her to get away from her mailbox immediately. Janet walked back to her house saying Lila was being paranoid and unfriendly. Lila gathered her scattered mail, took photos of Janet walking away, and drove straight to the police station. She filed a report for mail tampering and showed them the pictures. The officer said he'd send someone to talk to Janet about federal mail crimes. 2 police officers showed up at Janet's house the next morning. They stood on her porch for 20 minutes explaining that opening or taking someone else's mail was a federal offense. Janet called Troy 15 times that afternoon, leaving messages about Lila harassing her by weaponizing law enforcement. She said Lila was making false reports to intimidate her family. She demanded the HOA take action against Lila for filing frivolous police reports. Troy stopped answering her calls after message number 15. He sent a group text to the board saying he was done being Janet's complaint hotline. He said if she had legitimate concerns, she could submit them in writing like everyone else. Janet's 2 other kids started appearing in their backyard more often while Tommy stayed inside. The 6-year-old played alone on the swing set. The 11-year-old daughter sat on the porch steps reading books and looking miserable. I watched them through my kitchen window while making dinner and wondered what their home life felt like. Janet's paranoia was growing. Her isolation was getting worse. Those kids were stuck living with someone who saw enemies everywhere and couldn't admit she'd created her own problems. The daughter looked up at Janet's security cameras sometimes like she knew her mom was watching from inside. It made my chest hurt thinking about what those kids dealt with behind closed doors. Garrett approached me in the cereal aisle at the grocery store looking uncomfortable. He apologized for his wife's behavior and said he was working on the situation at home. He asked for patience while he figured things out. His eyes looked tired. His shoulders were slumped. I realized he was probably dealing with way more than we saw from the street. He mentioned Tommy missed playing with Oliver and asked if they could maybe see each other at the school activities where Janet wouldn't be around. I said that would be fine and told him I was sorry his whole family was caught up in this mess. He nodded and walked away, pushing his cart like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Janet started a blog called Neighborhood Watch Truth in late October. She posted long articles about the decline of community standards and permissive parenting destroying our streets. She didn't name anyone specifically, but the details made it obvious she was writing about us. She described kids riding bikes too fast and parents who worked from home instead of supervising properly. She wrote about neighbors who ganged up on families trying to maintain proper values. The post got longer and more unhinged each day. She claimed certain people were trying to drive good families out of the neighborhood. She said property values would drop because of the chaos and lack of discipline. Reading it felt like watching someone spiral in real time. Lila found the blog first and sent the link to our neighborhood group chat. We met at Jackson's house that evening to discuss how to respond. Lila said engaging would only feed Janet's victim story. She argued that responding publicly would give Janet ammunition to claim we were harassing her. We agreed to keep documenting everything but not respond directly to the blog. We'd let her rant into the void. Several people took screenshots of the post just in case we needed evidence later. Jackson's mom said the blog proved Janet wasn't handling the isolation well, and we should be prepared for her behavior to escalate further. Halloween planning started in early October, and the neighborhood organized a group trick or treating route. Someone suggested skipping Janet's block entirely to avoid confrontation. Everyone agreed immediately. Oliver felt guilty about Tommy missing out on Halloween. He spent an afternoon picking out candy he knew Tommy liked and putting together a bag with a note saying, "From your friends." We waited until after dark on Halloween Eve when Janet's lights were off. Oliver and I snuck up to Tommy's porch and left the bag by the door. We ran back to our house giggling like we'd just pulled off a heist. Oliver checked the porch the next morning and the bag was gone. Janet posted on her blog the day after Halloween about the cruel exclusion of her family from neighborhood activities. She claimed religious persecution even though she'd never mentioned religion before in any context. The post rambled for pages about discrimination and hostile environments and innocent children being punished for their parents' faith. She said certain neighbors were trying to force her family out through systematic harassment. She compared the situation to historical persecution. She suggested legal action might be necessary to protect her rights. The post got increasingly paranoid and disconnected from reality. Lila sent screenshots to everyone with a message saying Janet clearly wasn't coping well with the social isolation, and we should all be careful. The note came 3 days after Halloween. Oliver found it in his backpack during homework time, folded into a small square with his name written on the outside in Tommy's careful handwriting. I watched him open it and saw his face crumble as he read. He handed it to me without saying anything. Tommy had written that his mom said he couldn't go trick-or-treating at all this year because the neighborhood kids were being mean to their family, and he needed to learn that actions have consequences. Oliver's eyes filled with tears, and he asked why Tommy was getting punished when he didn't do anything wrong. I pulled him onto my lap, even though he was getting too big for it, and tried to explain that sometimes adults make bad choices that hurt kids who don't deserve it. He asked if there was anything we could do to help Tommy, and I had to tell him no, that Tommy's mom made the rules in their house. Oliver cried for 20 minutes about how unfair it was, and I had no good answers for him because he was right. It was completely unfair that a 9-year-old was missing Halloween because his mother couldn't accept the consequences of her own actions. I held him until he calmed down, and then we made hot chocolate and watched a movie. But I could tell he was still thinking about Tommy. Mariana called the next afternoon while Oliver was at soccer practice. She said she wanted to check in about how Oliver was handling everything with the neighborhood situation. I told her about the Halloween note and Oliver's reaction. She was quiet for a moment and then said Tommy had also started seeing her at the school. She couldn't share details because of privacy rules, but she wanted me to know that both boys were handling the situation better than many adults would. She said Oliver's ability to feel empathy for Tommy even while dealing with his own hurt showed real emotional strength. I felt proud of Oliver and worried about Tommy at the same time. Mariana suggested we keep doing what we were doing and let Oliver know it was okay to have complicated feelings about the whole thing. She said kids are often more resilient than we give them credit for, but they need adults to validate their emotions and help them process what's happening. November brought colder weather, and I noticed changes on our street. Garrett's car appeared in Janet's driveway more often, sometimes staying overnight. I wondered if he was finally taking a more active role in his family situation, or if something else was going on. Janet's blog posts became less frequent, dropping from daily rants to maybe twice a week. The security cameras still pointed at everyone's houses, but she didn't seem to be monitoring them as obsessively. Lila mentioned seeing Janet in her bathrobe at noon on a Tuesday, which was unusual for someone who normally maintained such rigid standards about appearances. The whole situation felt like watching someone slowly deflate. Part of me felt satisfied that Janet was facing consequences for her actions, but another part wondered what was happening inside that house with 3 kids who didn't ask for any of this. The neighborhood group chat started planning the Thanksgiving potluck in mid-November. Someone suggested the community park pavilion, and everyone agreed immediately. We discussed who would bring what dishes and whether we needed tables or if the park had enough. Lila offered to coordinate the kid activities, and Jackson's mom volunteered to handle decorations. Nobody mentioned inviting Janet. Not one person brought it up or asked if we should include her family. The exclusion had become so normal that we didn't even discuss it anymore. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling bothered by how easily we'd all accepted that Janet and her kids just wouldn't be part of neighborhood events. I understood why it happened, and I agreed with protecting our kids from her behavior, but the normalization of it felt wrong somehow. I typed out a message asking if we should at least tell Janet about the potluck and let her decide, then deleted it before sending. I didn't have the energy to be the person who defended Janet, and honestly, I didn't want her there either. Oliver asked about Tommy's Thanksgiving while we were making grocery lists. He wanted to know if Tommy's family would have a good holiday, or if Mrs. Janet would ruin it by being angry all the time. The question revealed how much he'd been thinking about Tommy's home life. I told him that Tommy had his dad and his brother and sister even when his mom was being difficult. I said families could have hard times but still care about each other, and that Tommy's dad seemed like he was trying to make things better. Oliver asked if we could invite Tommy over for Thanksgiving dessert, and I had to explain that Tommy's mom probably wouldn't allow it. He looked so disappointed that I promised we'd find a way to get Tommy a piece of pie somehow, even if I had to leave it on their porch like we did with the Halloween candy. I saw Janet at the grocery store the week before Thanksgiving. She looked exhausted and unkempt in a way I'd never seen before. Her hair needed washing, and she wore sweatpants with stains on them. No makeup, which was shocking for someone who used to get fully dressed just to get the mail. For a moment, I felt genuine concern for her mental health. She looked like she was barely holding it together. Then she saw me standing by the produce section, and her whole face changed. She turned around and walked toward another shopper, an older woman picking through apples. Janet spoke loud enough for half the store to hear, telling the woman to watch her purse around certain people because you never know who might be a thief. She stared directly at me while saying it. The older woman looked confused and uncomfortable. My sympathy evaporated instantly. I grabbed my groceries and left, refusing to give Janet the satisfaction of a reaction. December arrived with the first real snow, and the neighborhood transformed into a holiday display competition. Most families put up modest decorations, some lights, and maybe an inflatable snowman. Janet covered her entire house in lights so bright they illuminated 3 houses in every direction. She had 6 different light-up reindeer, 2 Santa displays, and a nativity scene that took up most of her front yard. The lights blinked in patterns that were probably supposed to be festive, but felt aggressive. Lila texted the group chat joking about needing blackout curtains because Janet's display made it impossible to sleep past 6 a.m. when the lights came on. Jackson's dad suggested we all chip in to buy Janet a dimmer switch. The jokes helped, but the display felt like another way for Janet to assert her presence and remind us she was still there, still watching, still judging. Oliver found a card in our mailbox one afternoon when he got home from the school. It had a drawing of 2 stick figures playing basketball, one labeled Oliver and one labeled Tommy. Inside, Tommy had written in his careful handwriting that he hoped next year they could be real friends again and play together like they used to. He'd drawn stars around the border and colored them in with marker. Oliver stood in the kitchen holding the card with tears in his eyes, but this time they were happy tears mixed with sad ones. He asked if he could put it somewhere special, and I helped him tack it to the bulletin board in his room where he could see it every day. He stood looking at it for a long time, tracing the basketball hoops Tommy had drawn with his finger. The neighborhood holiday party happened at Jackson's house 2 weeks before Christmas. All the kids participated in a gift exchange with a $10 limit. Everyone put their names in a hat and drew randomly. Oliver reached in and somehow pulled out Tommy's name. He stared at the slip of paper like it was magic. He spent 3 days agonizing over what to get Tommy, rejecting every suggestion I made. Finally, he decided on a book about basketball that had stories about famous players and tips for improving your game. He made me promise I would deliver it secretly, so Tommy would get it even though he couldn't come to the party. I wrapped it carefully, and Oliver wrote a card that just said, "From your friends," because he thought it would be less sad than putting his own name. I waited until after dark to deliver the gift. Janet's house was blazing with lights, but I could see through the front window that the family was in the back of the house. I walked quickly up the porch steps and left the wrapped book by the door with the tag clearly visible. My heart pounded like I was doing something illegal instead of just leaving a present for a kid. 2 days later, I found a note under our door when I got up for coffee. Tommy had written that the basketball book was his favorite present, and he was reading it every night before bed. He said the chapter about practice drills was helping him get better, and he couldn't wait to show Oliver his new moves someday. Oliver read the note 5 times at breakfast, and then carried it around in his pocket all day. That night, I heard him in his room reading out loud and realized he was practicing the drills from the book, so he'd be ready when Tommy could finally play with him again. Janet's blog went quiet 3 days after Christmas. I checked it every morning during that first week, expecting another rambling post about neighborhood persecution or property values, but the site stayed frozen on her last entry about community standards. By the second week, Lila texted the group chat asking if anyone else had noticed the silence. Jackson's mom replied that maybe Janet finally got the message. Troy said we shouldn't get our hopes up. I wanted to believe it was over, that Janet had decided to move on and focus on her own family, instead of monitoring everyone else's lives. But Lila called me on New Year's Eve while Oliver was at a sleepover and told me she didn't buy it for a second. She said people like Janet don't just stop. They pause, they regroup, they wait for the right moment to come back harder. I poured myself wine and listened to Lila explain that the quiet felt more like the eye of a storm than actual peace. She'd dealt with someone similar at her old neighborhood, and the pattern was always the same. Escalate, face consequences, go silent, then return with a new strategy. I went to bed that night feeling uneasy despite the calendar turning over to a fresh year. January hit us with cold that made your face hurt after 30 seconds outside. The kids stopped playing in the street and everyone retreated into their houses, which meant less interaction with Janet, but also less interaction with each other. Oliver spent afternoons doing homework at the kitchen table while I worked in my office, and the neighborhood felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with Janet's behavior. One Thursday, I noticed Oliver carrying a purple folder to the school that I'd never seen before. When I asked about it, he said it was for a project and changed the subject quickly. The next week, I saw him carefully placing a folded paper inside the folder before putting it in his backpack. I didn't push because I had a pretty good idea what was happening. Tommy was still grounded from coming over, but the boys had figured out they could pass notes through the school system. Oliver had created an elaborate folder system with different colored tabs, and I'd catch him reading papers at his desk, and then carefully filing them away. I pretended not to notice because those notes seemed to be the only thing keeping Oliver's spirits up during the long, cold weeks when nobody played outside. The HOA annual meeting notice arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday in late January. It was the standard reminder about the February gathering where they'd review the budget and discuss any community issues. I was about to toss it in my recycling when I saw the attached agenda. Janet had submitted a formal proposal for neighborhood conduct rules. The document was 3 pages long and included mandatory quiet hours from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., a list of approved outdoor activities with time restrictions, and the creation of a neighborhood review board that would handle complaints about rule violations. Troy sent an email to everyone except Janet within an hour of the notices going out. His message was short and direct. Janet planned to push hard for these rules at the meeting. She'd apparently spent weeks drafting the proposal and had even consulted with someone about HOA governance procedures. Troy warned us that if we didn't want these rules, we needed to show up and speak against them, because Janet would definitely show up prepared. The February meeting happened on the coldest night of the month. I bundled Oliver up and dropped him at Jackson's house, where Jackson's mom had arranged for a babysitter to watch all the neighborhood kids during the meeting. The community center meeting room was packed with more people than I'd ever seen at an HOA gathering. Janet sat in the front row with a laptop and a stack of printed materials. She'd dressed up like she was going to a business presentation, wearing a blazer and skirt while everyone else was in jeans and sweaters. Troy called the meeting to order and went through the standard budget items quickly because everyone knew what we were really there to discuss. When he got to new business, Janet stood up and walked to the front with her laptop. She'd prepared a full PowerPoint presentation. The first slide said, Community Standards Initiative in large letters. For the next 20 minutes, Janet clicked through slides about declining property values, the importance of behavioral guidelines, and statistics about neighborhoods with formal conduct rules. She talked about protecting investments and maintaining family-friendly environments. She showed photos of kids playing basketball at 9 p.m. and riding bikes during what she called dinner hours. She had graphs comparing our street to other neighborhoods with stricter oversight. Her final slide outlined the proposed review board structure with monthly meetings to address violations and a point system for repeat offenders. When Janet finished, Troy asked if anyone wanted to speak about the proposal. 8 families raised their hands. Jackson's dad went first and said he'd lived here for 12 years and never needed someone telling him when his kids could ride bikes. Lila stood up and calmly explained that she'd moved here specifically because it wasn't an overly regulated community. The family 3 houses down talked about how their teenagers' basketball practice schedule meant evening games were necessary. Mrs. Chen spoke in her quiet voice about how she loved hearing children playing outside because it made her feel less lonely. One by one, neighbors stood and spoke against the proposal. Some were angry, some were measured, but all of them made clear they didn't want Janet's rules governing their daily lives. Troy called for a vote. Janet voted yes. Everyone else voted no. The proposal failed to get a single vote beyond Janet's own. Janet's face went red as Troy announced the results. She grabbed her laptop and materials, knocking over her water bottle in the process. Water spread across the table, but she didn't stop to clean it up. She marched toward the door and then turned around to face everyone. Her voice came out loud and shaking when she started talking about discrimination and persecution. She said the neighborhood was run by a tyranny of the majority that targeted good families. She claimed we were creating an unsafe environment for children, and that she'd been driven to this point by months of harassment. People shifted in their seats, but nobody responded. Janet kept going, her voice getting higher and more frantic, until Troy stood up and asked her to please leave if she was done speaking. She left, slamming the door hard enough that the sound echoed through the building. Her blog roared back to life that same night. The first post went up at 11 p.m. with the title, Tyranny of the Majority. She wrote about being shouted down at the meeting, which wasn't what happened, and about good families being driven out by mob rule. Over the next week, she posted daily, sometimes multiple times per day. The post got longer and more rambling. She wrote about property rights and freedom of speech and persecution of traditional values. She started capitalizing random words for emphasis. One post included a list of every neighbor who'd spoken against her proposal with commentary about each family's supposed failings. Lila called it unhinged. Troy stopped checking the blog because he said it was bad for his blood pressure. Garrett caught me at the mailbox on a Saturday morning in March. He looked different from the last time I'd seen him, thinner and tired in a way that went beyond just lack of sleep. He asked if we could talk for a minute, and I said sure. We stood there in the cold while he told me they were thinking about moving. Janet couldn't let any of this go, and it was affecting their whole family. Tommy cried himself to sleep some nights. Their daughter had started having stomach problems that the doctor said were stress-related. Even their youngest was acting out at the school. Garrett said he'd tried talking to Janet about getting help, but she insisted everyone else was the problem. He looked defeated standing there holding his mail, and I felt this complicated mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved they might leave. Part of me felt guilty that my actions had contributed to a family being pushed out of their home. Part of me was angry that Janet's behavior was hurting her own kids, and Garrett seemed helpless to stop it. I told him I was sorry things had gotten to this point. He just nodded and walked back to his house. Tommy's notes to Oliver became less frequent after that conversation with Garrett. Oliver would check his purple folder every day after school, and some days there'd be nothing new. He started worrying out loud that Tommy was giving up on their friendship. I called Mariana at the school and asked if she could check on both boys. She said she couldn't share details about her sessions with Tommy, but assured me he was okay, and dealing with a lot at home. The way she said it made clear that Janet's behavior was getting worse inside the house, not better. Oliver kept writing notes and putting them in the folder even when he didn't get responses. He'd write about what happened at the school, or what he was reading, or just that he hoped Tommy was doing all right. I found him crying at his desk one night with the folder open in front of him. He said he was scared Tommy thought he wasn't a good friend anymore. I held him and promised that Tommy knew Oliver cared, but I wasn't sure I believed my own words. March brought the first warm days that felt like actual spring. The temperature hit 60 degrees on a Tuesday, and suddenly the street filled with kids again. Bikes appeared from garages, basketballs started bouncing, and the sound of children playing returned after months of quiet. Janet was on her porch within an hour. She stood there watching everyone with her phone in her hand, filming constantly. Every time a kid rode past her house, she'd point the phone at them. When Oliver and his friends played basketball in our driveway, she'd film from her porch for 20 minutes straight. The kids noticed, and it made them uncomfortable. Jackson asked his mom why Mrs. Janet was always recording them. Oliver started looking over his shoulder every few minutes to see if she was watching. The atmosphere felt heavy and wrong, like we were all being monitored by someone looking for violations. Lila texted the group chat saying this had to stop. The constant filming was creating an environment where kids couldn't just be kids. Lila filed a harassment complaint with the police on Thursday. She'd documented 2 weeks of Janet filming her children playing in their own yard. Several other neighbors added their names to the complaint, including us. The police came out on Friday afternoon and talked to Janet about reasonable expectations of privacy. They explained that while she could have security cameras on her property, constantly filming neighbors and their children crossed into harassment territory. They asked her to stop the excessive recording. The officer who came to our house afterward to follow up said Janet had insisted she was documenting evidence of neighborhood violations and claimed she had every right to film anything visible from her property. He told her that technically true, but that the pattern of behavior was creating problems. He advised her to find a different way to address her concerns. The officer looked tired when he said it, like he knew his words wouldn't make any difference. Janet ignored the police completely. The next day, she was back on her porch with her phone, filming everyone who passed. Her blog filled with posts about police harassment and violations of her rights. She wrote about living in a surveillance state where concerned citizens were punished for trying to protect their communities. The posts included screenshots of neighborhood kids with faces circled in red marker and timestamps noting supposed violations of common decency. Lila called Troy asking what else could be done. Troy said the HOA had limited power beyond what they'd already done. Unless Janet broke actual laws or HOA rules, they were stuck. We were all stuck, really, living under constant surveillance from someone who'd decided we were the enemy. Garrett's car disappeared from the driveway in mid-April. One day it was there, the next it was gone, along with what looked like half the garage contents. 2 days later, a for sale sign appeared in Janet's yard. The neighborhood group chat exploded. Jackson's mom sent a string of shocked face emojis. Someone else wrote finally. Troy sent a message saying he had mixed feelings. Lila wrote that she felt relief and guilt in equal measure. I stared at my phone reading the messages and felt all of those things at once. Relief that Janet would be leaving. Guilt about what this meant for Tommy and his siblings. Concern about whether Janet's kids would be okay after all this. Anger that it had come to this point. The sign stood there in the yard like a statement, and I wondered what Tommy thought when he saw it. Whether he understood that his mom's behavior had cost them their home and his friendships. The for sale sign came down on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later. I watched from the kitchen window as Tommy knocked on our door, wearing a backpack and sneakers that looked brand new. Oliver opened it before I could get there, and the two boys stood looking at each other for a second before Tommy asked if Oliver wanted to play basketball. Oliver glanced back at me with wide eyes and I nodded. They walked to the driveway together, Tommy bouncing the ball once, twice, testing the silence between them. Oliver grabbed his own ball from the garage and they started shooting without saying much. I watched them miss easy layups and fumble passes, both of them rusty with each other. Then Tommy made a joke about Oliver's terrible free throw, and Oliver laughed, and suddenly they were running plays and calling out scores like the 8 months hadn't happened at all. I brought them lemonade an hour later, and Tommy thanked me 3 times, overly polite in a way that made my chest hurt. Oliver asked if Tommy could stay for lunch, and I said yes before Tommy could make excuses. While I made sandwiches, Tommy explained that his dad had him and his siblings now while his parents figured things out. He said it casual, like he was talking about switching classrooms, but his shoulders looked lighter than I'd seen them in months. His dad didn't care about his mom's rules, Tommy said. He could ride bikes after 6 and play basketball whenever he wanted, and his friends could come over without anyone checking a list. He lived between 2 houses now, his dad's apartment and his mom's new place across town, but he seemed okay with it. Better than okay, actually. He ate his sandwich in big bites and asked if they could play video games after, and Oliver grinned so wide I thought his face might split. The moving truck showed up at Janet's house on a Tuesday in May. I was working at my desk when I heard the backup beeping and looked out to see the huge truck blocking half the street. Janet stood on her front porch in jeans and a t-shirt, pointing at boxes and directing 2 guys who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. She'd lost weight, I realized. Her face looked thinner and her clothes hung loose. She kept checking her phone and turning in circles like she couldn't remember what came next. One of the movers carried out a lamp I recognized from her living room window, the one that used to glow every evening when she'd watch the street. I felt something unexpected twist in my stomach. Not quite sympathy, but something close to it. Sadness, maybe. For what could have been different if she'd just been a little less certain she was right about everything. Oliver came home from the school and saw the truck. He stood at our front window watching for a while before asking if we should say goodbye to Mrs. Janet. I looked at my son, this kid who'd been yelled at and excluded and scared in a thunderstorm, and felt proud that his first instinct was still kindness. We spent the evening making chocolate chip cookies, Oliver's favorite recipe. He wrote a card at the kitchen table, tongue poking out while he concentrated on getting the letters straight. The card said he hoped Janet's family would be happy in their new house, and that he was sorry things had been hard. He signed it with a drawing of a basketball and his name in careful print. We walked over after dark when the moving truck was gone and left the bag of cookies and card on her porch, tucked against the door where she'd find them in the morning. Janet's family left early on a Tuesday. I heard car doors slamming before 7 in the morning and went to the window to see 2 cars packed with suitcases and bags. Janet's van held her 3 kids and her, while a sedan I didn't recognize must have been the new owners coming to get keys. Janet never looked at any of the houses around her. She kept her eyes down, loading the last few items and checking her phone. Her kids climbed into the van quietly, none of them waving or saying goodbye to anyone. Then Garrett's car pulled up and Tommy got out. He'd been staying with his dad but came to say goodbye to his mom and siblings. Janet hugged him stiffly and said something I couldn't hear. Tommy nodded and stepped back. When Garrett's car started pulling away, Tommy turned and looked at our house. Oliver was standing at his bedroom window. Tommy raised his hand in a slow wave. Oliver pressed his palm against the glass and I saw his shoulders shaking. I went to his room and put my arm around him while he cried, watching his friend leave for the last time from that house. The Contreras family moved in that Saturday with a smaller truck and a lot more laughter. Their teenage daughter Maria helped carry boxes while their son Carlos directed traffic in the driveway. Mrs. Contreras came over within an hour to introduce herself, bringing homemade empanadas and asking about the neighborhood. By Sunday evening, she'd joined the group chat and offered to babysit for any family that needed it. Maria started watching Jackson's little sister 2 afternoons a week. Carlos helped Mrs. Chen pull weeds from her garden and fix a broken fence post. The energy on the street shifted. People started leaving their garage doors open again and kids played in front yards instead of hiding in backyards. The Contreras family brought music and food to every gathering and never once mentioned rules about noise or bikes or proper behavior. Summer hit in June with temperatures that sent everyone outside. Kids filled the street from morning until the streetlights came on, riding bikes and playing basketball and covering the sidewalks with chalk art that stretched from the house to the house. Nobody complained about the noise. Nobody filmed anyone. Nobody stood on their porch monitoring who played with whom. Jackson organized a water balloon fight that soaked half the neighborhood, and parents laughed instead of scolding. Oliver played until he was sunburned and exhausted every single day, making up for months of walking on eggshells. The basketball hoop in our driveway saw constant use, games running until 10 at night with parents sitting on porches watching and chatting. Lila started hosting movie nights in her backyard, projecting films onto a white sheet while kids sprawled on blankets eating popcorn. Tommy came every other weekend when he stayed with Garrett. The first time he showed up after the move, he and Oliver picked up exactly where they'd left off, arguing about which video game to play first and racing bikes to the end of the cul-de-sac. Garrett told me over coffee one Saturday that Tommy was doing better in therapy, working through his feelings about the divorce and his mom's behavior. He seemed happier overall, Garrett said, more relaxed. He'd made new friends at his new school but still asked to visit Oliver every chance he got. Garrett looked tired but lighter too, like he'd been carrying something heavy for years and finally put it down. He thanked me for letting Tommy keep coming over, for not holding his mom's actions against him. I told him Tommy was always welcome here, that Oliver needed his friend as much as Tommy needed Oliver. Oliver brought home his report card in mid-June with good grades and a note from his teacher about his growth this year. Mariana called me that same week to say Oliver had made real progress in their sessions, processing the adult conflict in healthy ways while maintaining his natural kindness. She said he'd learned hard lessons about unfairness and complicated situations, but hadn't let them make him mean or bitter. He still helped Mrs. Chen with groceries and played with younger kids without being asked. He'd grown up some this year, learned that adults could be wrong and that standing up to bad behavior mattered. But he'd kept the parts of himself that made him Oliver, the parts that wanted to make cookies for someone who'd been cruel to him because moving was hard, even when you'd brought it on yourself. The neighborhood held a block party in July on a Saturday when the heat finally broke. Everyone brought food without anyone assigning dishes or organizing committees. Troy grilled burgers and hot dogs. Lila made a huge fruit salad. The Contreras family brought enough tamales to feed 20 people. Kids ran through sprinklers and played games while adults sat in lawn chairs talking and laughing. Someone set up a volleyball net. Someone else brought a speaker for music. It was loud and messy and completely unstructured. Kids eating whenever they were hungry and adults refilling drinks as needed. Nobody tried to control anything. Nobody made rules about quiet hours or proper behavior. It was exactly the kind of chaotic, joyful community gathering that Janet would have hated and exactly what we all needed. I ran into Garrett at Back to the School night in August. The cafeteria was packed with parents trying to find their kids' classrooms, and teachers were setting up stations with curriculum information. I was reading through Oliver's 5th grade schedule when Garrett appeared next to me holding papers for Tommy's class at his new school. He looked better than the last time I'd seen him, less tired around the eyes. We stepped into the hallway where it was quieter, and he told me Janet was getting help in their new town. Therapy twice a week and medication that seemed to be working. She was doing somewhat better, he said, though it was a slow process. He thanked me for letting Tommy keep coming over on weekends, for not holding his mom's actions against him. It had been crucial for Tommy's stability during the divorce and the move. The friendship with Oliver gave him something constant when everything else kept changing. I told him Tommy was always welcome and meant it. The boys had picked up their friendship like no time had passed at all. Oliver started 5th grade 3 weeks later looking confident in his new backpack and sneakers. He had a solid group of friends now, including Jackson and the other neighborhood kids. Tommy visited every other weekend, and they'd spend hours playing basketball or building things in our yard. The thunderstorm incident was part of Oliver's story, but not the thing that defined him anymore. He'd learned that standing up to wrong behavior mattered, that adults could be unfair, that sometimes doing the right thing meant making hard choices. But he was still the kid who helped Mrs. Chen with her groceries and made sure younger kids got included in games. He'd grown up some this year without losing the parts of himself that made him good. September arrived, and I realized we'd been on Maple Street for exactly 1 year. The anniversary hit me while I was making coffee one morning and looking out at the quiet street. Our life looked nothing like what I'd expected when we moved here. I thought we'd have normal neighbor problems like noise complaints or property line disputes. Instead, we'd been through something exhausting and ugly that forced me to protect my child in ways I never imagined. The conflict with Janet taught me to set boundaries without apologizing, to document everything, to rally support when someone threatened my kid. It taught me that being nice wasn't the same as being good, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was refuse to tolerate cruelty. I'd turned an entire neighborhood against a woman, and her family moved away because of it. That reality sat heavy some days, even though I knew we'd done what needed doing. I stood at the kitchen window on a warm fall evening, watching Oliver and his friends play basketball in our driveway. The sun was setting, and they were trying to finish their game before dark. Their voices carried across the yard, laughing and arguing about fouls and scores. Lila was in her front yard watering flowers. The Contreras family was grilling dinner, and their daughter was setting up a table outside. Mrs. Chen sat on her porch with a book. It looked peaceful and normal, exactly the kind of neighborhood we'd wanted. But getting here meant deciding who didn't belong in it. We'd created a safer place for our kids by excluding someone, and that exclusion had real casualties. Janet's kids didn't deserve to suffer for their mom's behavior, but they had anyway. Tommy lost his friends and his home because his mother couldn't stop herself from being cruel. Life was complicated that way, full of choices that hurt even when they were necessary. I watched Oliver sink a basket and high-five Jackson, both of them grinning in the fading light. We'd built something good together out of something ugly. The process wasn't pretty, and the cost wasn't fair, but I was okay with the messy reality of what we'd created.